There's a lot of discussion in my recent swap video on when you need to be swapping in Overwatch 2 on the importance and the underrated aspect of map choice. In terms of you can even play into a lot of hard counters, soft counters, and so on if the map is really good for your character, allowing you ways of outplaying many of those characters. However, a lot of discussion was, okay, well then what are good maps for different characters? What are bad maps for different characters? And I realized that there's not a lot of discussion about what are the best maps for Winston, what are the bad maps for Widowmaker. And while some of you might be like, well, that's obvious, that's not obvious for everybody, and it's certainly not obvious for some of the more niche characters like Junkrat, Bastion, Torbjorn, and even characters like Ana. What are the best Ana maps? What are the worst Ana maps? And what are we really looking for? Now, this map guide is going to be far from exhaustive and is mostly aimed for some balance between low rank opinion and high rank opinion. I know there's going to be somebody in the chat who was like, that's actually not a bad Doomfist map. There's some crazy, super techie rollouts that you can do, but the reality of the situation is the vast majority of Doomfist players are not going to know or not going to be able to do those things. So what is the average player's experience going to be like on what map? What maps are going to feel relatively good with the basics of the character, and what maps are going to feel relatively bad? And this may not even be necessarily the absolute best and the absolute worst. This was spent about 5 to 10 minutes for each character thinking about going over each map. Okay, which one's good, which one's bad? And it's definitely something that I could have made a couple of mistakes with. If you think I made any mistakes, if you would make any corrections to this list, let me know what you think in the comments. But regardless of whether you think it's the absolute best or the absolute worst, this map guide is going to be a very, very helpful tier list, a bit of a basic intro to what you need to be looking for when you play a character, and what you need to not be looking for when you want to avoid a character. Now, to be very clear, I'm not going to say that if you are playing a character on a bad map, you're throwing. I think for many of the characters, there's still lots of ways of outplaying, and if you want to one-trick a character or find a way to make that character work, I encourage you to. But if you're looking to find what the prime situation to pick each character, this map guide is going to be a good general guideline. Once again, a good map doesn't mean it's always the play, and a bad map doesn't mean it's always not the play. These are just general guidelines, and use them at your own discretion. We're going to be starting with the tanks, the DPS, finally the supports. So Mauga at the moment doesn't have any vertical mobility. So Mauga is generally going to be looking for flatter maps that don't have super long sightlines. His poke damage, despite having a lot of range, his hitbox is so big, and because he doesn't have any damage mitigation, he actually kind of struggles sometimes in pokier maps. So generally Mauga is going to like the maps that are a little bit more close oriented and maps that don't have a lot of high ground. He's going to enjoy a map like Oasis because even the verticality on City Center is something he can easily access with the jump pad. There's a lot of short sightlines, a lot of brawl sightlines, a lot of ways to play around that map. Bad maps would be avoiding a lot of high ground and avoiding a lot of sniper sightlines. And so maps like Dorado, where it's not only sniper oriented, but there's a lot of verticality, and maps like Junkertown were the exact same issue. A lot of verticality, a lot of sightlines can be very difficult to close the distance. Diva's got a lot of verticality, the complete opposite of Mauga, but she doesn't have a lot of poke damage. So anywhere where she can move in and around the map, and even points where she can contest and move the payload by herself, can be really useful. For that reason, she's actually really good with Dorado, and she kind of struggles a little bit on flatter maps like Flashpoint, New Junk City, and Suravasa, where there's not a lot of high ground, there's not a lot of ways to use high ground. I think even dive characters like Winston and Wrecking Ball are a little bit less reliant than high ground than Diva, because she just doesn't really have that speed and mobility that she needs, so she really relies on high ground, and those points on Flashpoint just don't really hit it. And also, for King of the Hill, Busan is actually not a great Diva point. There's a couple things that on downtown you can fight her on point. Diva's pretty good there. But either fights that happen away from point, Mecha Base can be troublesome, and Sanctuary, that wide open space, is absolute misery. Doomfist, character that actually has quick mobility, so he's not as bad with low verticality maps. A map like Ilios can feel pretty good. A lot of verticality, a lot of ways to quickly close the distance, a lot of CC opportunities, especially getting kills off the map. And even a map like Ilios Ruins, there's not a lot of high ground to utilize. There's still a lot of cover. We can quickly close the distance and engage on the enemy team. Honorable mention actually goes to Circuit Royale. So you guys are going to see the rest of this video is just punching on how bad of a map Circuit Royale is and how bad it feels for so many characters. But Circuit Royale is Doomfist is probably the best dive tank on Circuit Royale because he has more of that frontline presence, AoE pressure, and his ultimate can be used to kill snipers in the backline. I think many of the other dive tanks feel really bad on Circuit, and Doom still doesn't feel great, but he's probably the best dive tank if you want to play a dive tank on Circuit Royale. Next up, Junkerqueen. Junkerqueen really enjoys those flat maps with the short sightlines. Again, the lack of verticality with a little bit of speed is something that's going to feel really good on Flashpoint, especially a map like Suravasa, which is the slightly more congested Flashpoint, where it's a little bit easier for people to close the distance. Junkerqueen's going to feel really great in there. She's not going to have to worry about big, long sightlines, and she's not going to have to worry about a lot of high ground that she can't access. which means she's not going to feel that great on Gibraltar and Paraiso. A lot of really nasty high ground, a lot of sightlines that feel almost impossible for her to close the distance on. Generally don't enjoy playing Junkerqueen on those points. Moving on to Orisa. Orisa is kind of similar to Mauga, but she doesn't quite have the same amount of verticality. So Orisa is going to be Ilios. Ilios is an okay map for a lot of tanks because of that verticality and sightlines. And you might be thinking, well, why does the verticality on Ilios good for Orisa? She doesn't have that verticality. Well, it's because the verticality is more optional in a lot of ways, and she could just simply play like a brawl tank that doesn't have to worry about crazy long sightlines. You see, what makes Orisa unique in a bad way for a lot of brawl tanks is she doesn't have any form of mobility. She doesn't have a pin. She doesn't have a Nemesis form speed boost. She doesn't even have the run that Mauga has. So she really requires targets being immediately close and staying close. And that's something that Ilios generally provides fairly well, as well as having a couple of environmental kill opportunities. Bad maps from her, long sightlines, high grounds, similar to Junkerqueen. Gibraltar is not going to feel good, and Numbani is also not going to feel great either, although third point is a little bit less bad. Ramattra. Again, you're noticing a theme here, lack of verticality, but at least with Ramattra, you got a little bit of damage potential at range, and you have a little bit of speed with your Nemesis form. A good map like Colosseo, tight area, lots of opportunities to poke, and then lots of opportunities to actually close that distance. Not a lot of crazy flanks that can be kind of difficult for Ramattra to deal with. It's a great map for Ramattra. And then bad maps are the exact opposite on push, where New Queen Street, where things can tend to open up a little bit more, and that can be a multi-angled approach that Ramattra doesn't really enjoy. Similarly, Dorado, multi-angle approach, but even worse, a lot of really nasty sightlines and high ground. Not a great combo for Ramatra's success. Reinhardt. Obviously, Lijiang Tower. Was I going to say any other map? Not only is Control Center really great for that brawl potential, but also things like being able to pin across the choke on gardens, across the bridge, be able to take the fight on point on all of those points. Really, there's so many ways to utilize the brawl potential, the shield, the swinging, the pin, the shatter. Just even the fact that all the fights happen on really friendly Reinhardt points for swinging your hammer, hitting in shatters, and so on is really, really useful. You don't even necessarily need a Symmetra teleporter to make this map work. Bad maps for Reinhardt, probably, again, similar to the verticality of Dorado, Paraiso, not amazing. I actually asked LH Cloudy what he thought the worst maps were, and his first response was definitely Dorado, Paraiso, and I think I would agree with that. It can be difficult to clear high grounds in this map, although it is doable, more doable for than many other brawl tanks, but it still doesn't always feel that good. Long sightlines, high grounds, not a great combo. Roadhog. Now, Roadhog is a bit of a tricky one. He does have a little bit of poke damage. He has that self-sustain, so there aren't too many bad Roadhog maps. A good map like Ilios, there's lots of kill potential, hooks off the map, boops to the whole hog, enough short sightlines, and yet pokier options if you want to be fishing for hooks and keep your distance. There's a couple of bad maps. I don't love Havana that much, and Gibraltar as well. Havana is a weird one where it feels like, oh, it's a pokey map, so having a hook hero may be good, but when Roadhog's the only tank, he's just a punching bag, really, and it's really hard to take a solo off angle by yourself, especially on points like first and third. Gibraltar, the high ground can be really miserable, and even late third point where things get a little bit flatter, it's still really tricky to get consistent value with Roadhog. Sigma, Circuit Royale, he's great on it. Many of the weaknesses of Sigma, which are off angles and having to deal with that verticality, it's things that aren't as prevalent on Circuit Royale. That nasty little choke right down the middle, there just isn't a better tank in the game at controlling that level of space. Maps like New Junk City and Gibraltar can feel a little bit trickier because not only do things open up in terms of verticality, but they open up in terms of flanks. So a lot of heroes with a lot of mobility can get in and around your shield. And even though New Junk City doesn't have the high ground, because those flanks are so deep and because you have to move around so much on Flashpoint, a character without any form of mobility at all can sometimes struggle. Although I will say Sigma is quite good on third point, watch point, Gibraltar, because everything tends to kind of get a little bit more narrow. Winston, high ground good, long sightline bad, flat map bad. It's going to be Dorado with an honorable mention of Gibraltar. Lots of high grounds, lots of verticality. Sightlines can be a little bit tricky, but unlike Diva, you do have some capability of closing those distances quickly with the speed of your jump. Definitely recommend playing Winston on Dorado and Gibraltar. You could even play in encounters on those maps. And in terms of bad maps, New Junk City, very flat, very broad, and not a lot of high ground. And Havana, same kind of problems. Very flat, very broad, can be very difficult to close the distance, and it feels downright impossible in a couple of points. Wrecking Ball, Junkertown, push maps, Flashpoint. Wrecking Ball actually has a lot of good maps, even though the character may not always feel that great. There's a lot of maps that have a lot of options when it comes to flanks and angles, and he, unlike some of the other dive tanks, isn't quite as picky about high ground because he doesn't need the high ground to stage from. When he has so hyper mobile, he can just literally go behind you. High ground's good, which is why some of those maps are going to feel good, but on the maps where the wide open sightlines can feel absolutely toxic to dive tanks, those wide open sightlines can be actually a boon for Wrecking Ball. It can be really easy to set up on those flanks and stage on backline. So again, Junkertown, really all the push and Flashpoint are quite strong. Bad maps, Circuit Royale. Really hard to stage and backline on that map. You have to basically roll through the middle of the enemy team. If they have any sort of crowd control, you need some sort of crazy rollout. And then also, honestly, the way that the health packs are positioned, it can be actually difficult to disengage fights and then re-engage safely. It can often feel like your cycles take forever. It can be actually a bit of a tricky map. And even a map like King's Row can feel hard, where there's a lot of corridors, a lot of tight sight lines, and where your mines are going to get huge value on that map. It might be difficult to actually stage the dives that you want. And certainly there are other tanks that are going to do that job a little bit better. Zarya. Surprisingly, where King's Row has been the Reinhardt world, in many ways, Zarya does as well as Reinhardt in this map. There's lots of ways to poke. There's lots of ways to brawl. There's high grounds that you can play around. There's the Graviton gets massive value. You can enable your DPS with bubbles. Basically, Zarya on King's Row can kind of choose how she wants to take the engagement, either up close or from a little bit further away. Now, in pro competitive play, you're not going to see a lot of Zarya here because it's easy enough to pick a brawl tank like Ramattra, slap a Mei with him, and the Zarya just dies. But in most ranked experiences, you're going to have a fine time playing Zarya in King's Row. Bad maps for Zarya, there's a lot of them. In fact, we even had a hard time coming up with a relatively good map for Zarya because, again, like Orisa, she doesn't really have the mobility to close the distance or avoid matchups that she doesn't otherwise want to take. Gibraltar, Havana, long sightlines, long flanks. She feels really bad into snipers because if it's not a target you can actually beam or shoot, you're not really doing anything. And when you incorporate high ground with a character that doesn't have vertical mobility, with long sightlines with a character that doesn't have horizontal mobility, it's just not a great combo. That's going to wrap it up for tanks. Let me know what you think in the comments. We're going to move on to DPS. DPS. So we're moving on to Ashe here. Ashe loves those medium to long range sightlines. It's kind of ironic that the sniper character sometimes doesn't love sniper maps because they're super nasty with Widow and Hanzo. But if you find those kind of somewhere in between with a little bit of flexibility, Ashe feels really good. And Route 66 is one of those maps where you can often take sightlines that avoid Widowmakers if they have them. And if they don't have snipers, then you can take the longest sightline you want and basically be untouched almost the entirety of the game. Bad maps are maps where there's a lot of movement. Ashe, kind of like Sigma, doesn't like moving a whole lot unless she absolutely has to. Survivasa is one of those Flashpoint maps where there's a lot of movement required, and there's not a lot of really friendly sightlines. She can struggle a little bit on that map, as well as Li Jiang. Getting consistent sightlines, getting consistent flanks, sometimes it feels like you're just not going to be able to get a sightline that you want anywhere that you go. And I think that's one of the big things that Ashe struggles with. Bastion, good on King's Row. Relatively short sightlines, not a ton of verticality, a lot of value to be had with ultimate, with nade, just your general turret form. There's not a ton of really bad Bastion maps, but King's Row definitely feels like one of the better ones. And when it comes to the actual bad Bastion maps, well, it's basically snipers. Any character that Bastion can't get relatively close to, I mean, a Junkrat maybe you don't want to get close to, but most characters that Bastion can get medium to short range, he's going to be able to tear up whenever he wants. But Junkerqueen, Havana, and even a map like Gibraltar can feel very hard to actually have any sort of impact on anything that you can reach. Everything feels too far away, and your damage is really, really, really bad far away. And focusing the enemy tank down might not always work on those maps. Avoid Bastion on those maps if you can. Cassidy, oh boy, we had a hard time with this one. Character's not very good right now as of January 2024. Oasis feels pretty good. Feels like there's a decent number of short, medium sightline flanks where Cassidy can work. But the fact that he doesn't really perform super well in short ranges and doesn't perform super well in long ranges, really, where does he fit? And Oasis provides a little bit of opportunity to make plays, so we'll give it a good, but reality, there isn't really a good map for Cassidy. Bad maps are pretty obvious. This is where his fall off feels terrible. Circuit Royale, Gibraltar, anywhere where he can't take angles, too high ground, too sniper oriented. Do not play Cassidy on any of these sniper maps if they are on snipers. Maybe you can set up crazy flanks. I mean, legitimately on those maps, you'd have to go crazy flank Cassidy to get anything done, and that can have mixed results. Echo. Character with a lot of vertical mobility, hybrid between can get up close, can poke from afar. Ilios with a verticality and the long and short sightlines available is a great map for Echo. There's actually a lot of good maps for Echo. One of those bad maps are maps with super, super long sightlines where you can't close the distance. And if they go snipers on a map like Busan or Circuit Royale, you might have a pretty hard time. Man, Circuit Royale keeps coming up a lot. I wonder if it's going to come up anymore. Genji, good map. Ilios, short sightlines, long sightlines. You can poke. Brawl, can take high grounds, can take flanks. It's a great map. A lot of King of the Hill maps are going to feel good with Genji. And actually, we actually had a hard time thinking of bad maps for Genji because contrary to popular opinion, while the character may not be easy to hard counter, or may feel easy to soft counter, he's actually not that easy to hard counter. And there's actually a lot of maps that do provide Genji options. Even maps like Circuit Royale and Havana have options in certain points, different ways to play the fight. So A map like Busan or New Jung City that are relatively flat and relatively open will feel tricky, and they definitely belong in the bad category for Genji. But even those maps are playable. They're just a little bit trickier than others. Hanzo, longer sightlines, Junkertown. A lot of verticality. It's going to be a good place for you. One of the things that makes Hanzo unique to Widowmaker is the fact that he has that medium to long range hybrid, and Junkertown provides a lot of that. Plus, the frequent access to verticality is really nice in second and third point. Bad maps, any map where there's going to be a lot of movement, kind of similar to Ashe, or a map where it's strictly short sightlines. Map like Survasa and Oasis might feel kind of tricky. Oasis Gardens has its moments. City Center maybe get a good sightline, but in many ways, the compositions and heroes that you're likely to run into or more likely to run to in King of the Hill, faster characters, brawlier tanks, are going to give you fits on Oasis and Survasa, and so Hanzo may not always feel that good. Junkrat, he does short range damage. That's really all there is to it. King's Row, Eichenwald, just because first and third point are absolutely atrocious Junkrat maps. First point, Eichenwald defense, third point attack. It's actually insane how good that character is on that map, up to the point where occasionally you see it in pro play, more of a meme pick, but the fact that the character is even playable in pro play on those points tells you as much as you need to know. King's Row stays relevant all the way up until third point, in which case it gets a little bit tricky. Great short sightlines. Bad, Gibraltar, Circuit, honorable mention, Havana. It's not a mystery here. It's a long sightline, and they're not able to set up those flanks on one-shots in the backline that you otherwise would be able to set up. Yeah, avoid those maps for the most part. Mei is actually relatively flexible. She has brawl potential, she has poke potential, she has off-angle potential, and she even has a teeny bit of vertical mobility with that wall of hers. And so we actually enjoy Lijiang because it's the obvious choice. Great walls on all three of the points here. Again, fighting on point means a lot of value there, but even taking off-angles on that map means a lot of value. But we had a harder time choosing really, truly bad maps. We came up with Gibraltar just because of how long the sightlines are and how much verticality that doesn't really help you very much. And a map like Junkertown, where again, that verticality in those longer sightlines. But I do think she's playable in those maps. It's just not quite optimal. Pharah, another one of those characters that can feel really good or really bad. We're going to go back to Ilios here. Ruins, Lighthouse, even well to an extent. A lot of value can be found from Pharah with the amount of vertical cover that you can utilize in fighting around on point. Really, really strong character on this map. But terrible on any sort of sniper map where she can't take flanks and there isn't any sort of vertical cover. Those are going to be maps like Circuit, Junkertown. Going to be a lot of maps that Pharah feels really, truly bad on, and it kind of is a testament to her design as much of a testament to the map design. Reaper. Reaper's an interesting one. Feels good in a lot of the King of the Hill maps. We can get up close and personal. A lot of short off angles and flanks. Antarctica is actually, I think, a pretty good Reaper map. I think all 3 points are fairly decent for Reaper. I recommend hunt on that map. Bad Havana, Esperanza. Esperanza might not be the absolute worst map for Reaper, but is an underrated bad map because of how open that map is and how tough those flanks can be. Havana as well, for obvious reasons. Again, long sightlines, hard to set up flanks, hard to reach backline. And just focusing tank as Reaper is not always something you want to have to do. Sojourn is a relatively flexible character. She could do fairly well versus snipers, fairly well in a lot of situations. There's not really a terrible map for Sojourn, but there are some good maps, and one of those maps is Survasa. The ability to move around quickly, adapt to shorter or longer sightlines, and again, having a hit scan that can move quickly is really nice in Flashpoint for moving point A to point B and just being able to take different off angles. Super underrated. And in terms of bad maps, well, there wasn't really any really bad map, but Junkertown, Dorado isn't great. It's just more of sniper maps in terms of how long some of the sightlines are at times, and the vertical mobility can be a little bit inconsistent. There's some points that you are going to have a hard time reaching with your shift, or with your slide rather. And so I don't recommend Sojourn on those points, but I do think you can play them very, very well. And actually, she's very playable on like first and third point on Dorado, and Junkertown third is also pretty good as well. So it's more of like it's not bad for the character, but there are some tricky points that you might need to figure out with that character on those points, especially if they're running snipers. Soldier 76, pretty flexible, can take a lot of flanks. Vertical mobility isn't great with him, but he's got that horizontal mobility. New Junk City, New Queen Street. Anything where he can go broad on the breadth, on the angles, the flanks, he's going to do pretty well on. Bad map, Circuit Royale. Not really a lot of flanks that you can take in that map. You're probably going to be running the snipers. Not super fun. And Havana, for the exact same reason. Sombra. Sombra's a tricky one. Sombra's pretty flexible. Obviously, you do love wide open angles and a lot of space to be able to work onto the backline. New Queen Street is a great push map for that. Highly recommend playing Sombra on that map, especially because I think the health packs are actually quite useful for you as well. Some really crucial megas and minis to control on that map. And then in terms of bad maps, again, if you can't set up on backline, it's kind of hard. Circuit Royale, first point, even second point can be quite a disaster to even contest backline. And then when you do contest backline and try to translocate out, sometimes the cover isn't far isn't close enough, so you get spotted and spy check. It's really easy to it's a disaster. I played Sombra too many times on that map and had a terrible time. Even though there were easy Widowmakers to assassinate, I always freaking died. Definitely not a skill issue. Shambali, actually an underrated bad map for Sombra because, again, it takes very long to set up angles. And third point, oh my days, especially attacking third point can feel impossible to set up on backline on that map. So while Shambali may not be the worst map, it does have its difficulties, and don't even get me started in Circuit Royale. Symmetra, Lijiang Tower, your teleporter, your ult, TP, fights, turrets, everything is amazing on all 3 points. You can TP across the bridge, on gardens, directly on a point. You can TP out of spawn and control center and take the fight on either point or the choke on white. On night market, you can actually TP to point as well. And the turrets are good and your ult is good. And even if you don't TP to point, you can still TP out from spawn and you can poke or you can brawl. And it's just a great map for Symmetra all the way through. Highly recommend Lijiang Tower. And bad maps, again, I actually don't think Symmetra is super niche, at least certainly not as niche as people think she is. Kind of falls in the May category where it's not always optimal, but it's more flexible than I think people give her credit for. She can move around, she can set up her solo plays, but a map like Esperance might feel a little broad for her, and because the map is so big, your ult might not always get consistent value as well. And the same thing goes with Havana. It's not, again, the worst choice in the world, but it might be hard to set up the angles that you want, especially when you're set up an angle, but the sniper's still 40 meters away, and so she could still one-shot you. It's kind of tricky. Torbjorn, relatively shorter sightline character with a little bit of poke options. Oasis kind of fits the bill for me. You can kind of set up a turret to contest an off angle. Your ult on point is really useful. Your overload and your shotgun and your poke weapon kind of provides that nice hybrid that feels pretty good in that map. If you run into flankers, if you run into brawl characters, you're going to feel pretty good playing Torbjorn into that. But he hates playing in snipers, which means he doesn't want to play on, you guessed it, Havana and Junkerqueen. Circuit Royale definitely falls into the category here, but in theory, you could focus tank. Torbjorn has some pretty nasty tank damage, so there is options of playing with Torbjorn here. It's just not a very good one. Oh, also ult on Circuit Royale is pretty good. You can throw it in cart. It's pretty nice. Tracer, Blizzard World, really good. Wide open sightlines, mini flanks, almost impossible to stop you. Again, Tracer falls into the Genji category where it's like, there aren't really any bad maps for Tracer, but there are some maps that feel a little bit especially good. I think Blizzard World falls into that category. Bad map, Circuit Royale, shocker. You can't take a very good angle, really all the way up until third point. And even third point, the angles are really easy to contest. It doesn't feel good. Even Overwatch League players don't play Tracer much on Circuit Royale. Havana, better than Circuit Royale. There's more angles available, but again, it kind of comes down to first and third point where those angles, and even second point where those angles are very predictable and very easy to see. Tough hero to play on those maps. Widowmaker, you guys ready for the shock of a lifetime? She's good on Circuit Royale. No flanks to really worry about. Long sightlines, there just isn't really much else to say. She's bad on Oasis. Way too many flanks, way too many angles, hard to get good sightlines. I'd legitimately rather play Widowmaker on Lijiang Tower because at least you have Night Market, at least you have Gardens, longer sightlines, some angles available. Oasis feels very cramped, very ugly. And Suravasa as well. Flashpoint, a sleeper bad map for Widowmaker because even though a map like New Junk City has these long sightlines, you got to move so much, and there's so many flanks available to you. And then a map like Suravasa just takes all those flanks and most of the points and just compresses them by 20, 30%. And now your sightlines are worse. I don't really recommend playing Widowmaker on Flashpoint. All right, that's going to do it for this. We're going to move on to supports now. Okay, so it's going to be starting off with Ana. Ana was a tricky one. What makes Ana great? Well, she's got a sniper weapon. She's got decent range. She's got a bit of a hybrid playstyle. If you could set her up in a good position, she's useful. But she doesn't have vertical mobility. But does she need vertical mobility? I think Dorado really checks the box off because even if you're thinking about like, oh, well, what about the vertical mobility? Even if you're playing on attack, first, second, and third, generally your sight lines are good enough and you have good enough cover and enough positional options to where you can get cooldown and weapon value without necessarily being on the high ground. And if you're on defense, you have so many options from that high ground if you're able to start with it. I think Ana's certainly a good choice in Dorado. It might not be her best map, but she has so many pretty solid maps that it's hard to not give it to her. Bad maps, Circuit Royale. Boy, that map is getting a little too familiar. Longer sightlines, but there's sightlines that are contested by Widows and Hanzos and even Sojourns with Rail and Zenyatta's throwing right clicks down the choke, and it just feels like you can't even peek to get cooldown value. And then your ultimate is decent, but there are better support ultimates on that point. It's tricky. I don't love Circuit Royale with Ana. It's not the worst character to play on that point, but it's certainly not the best. And the same result goes with Havana as well. Havana, there's at least a couple more sightlines and angles that you can take, but again, sniper maps, ironically, the character that taunts Widowmaker is not the character you really want to play where you can't avoid the Widowmaker. It's not that you can't play Ana into snipers, you just might not be able to play Ana into snipers into sniper maps. Baptiste, really good in Colosseo. Narrow sightlines, heal damage value, that weapon play, your lamp, your shift, your window especially gets massive value in these narrow corridors. And that's also why Circuit Royale is going to get an honorable mention. Now you might be thinking, well, I can't even peek the sniper. How am I supposed to get weapon value? Yeah, but your ultimate's really strong in those narrow sightlines, and you can shoot tank and heal tank. You can do about as much as any support can on Circuit Royale. And so Baptiste may be the least bad support on Circuit Royale. There's one other that contests that position, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But he's decent on Circuit Royale, at least compared to a lot of other supports. Bad maps for Baptiste are maps where he has to move around a lot. There's a lot of verticality. A lot of people way over there that I can't heal and I can't shoot and fall off. And my ultimate is only here, but you're over there. And the verticality, I can't even consistently jump to the high ground. And that might be Gibraltar at points and times. It's also going to be second point Dorado. Or Dorado overall feels okay, but man, second point feels bad. I don't even know if you can consistently jump to the high ground early on. It only requires you to be later. The high ground you can't access. There are better heroes to be playing on second point Dorado than Baptiste most of the time, especially just with how little value many of your abilities get with how big the map is. And that includes your ultimate as well. Brigitte. Weird character, relatively flexible, doesn't really like long sightlines, likes shorter sightlines with the opportunity to disengage, because the irony is Brigitte is in this weird balance between she doesn't love playing versus snipers if she can't get close to them, but she doesn't love getting run over by Maze and Reapers and Rams and Rhines. You see, the hero fantasy of Brigitte has changed a lot over the last few years, from the frontline brawler to, oh my days, do not get close to anything that has a hammer, please. I guess it gives her PTSD from her father. I don't know. Regardless, you don't want maps that are too close. You want maps that provide opportunities for you to kind of keep your distance while still being able to swing on something when you want to, specifically squishies. And Rialto does an okay job of that. There's positions and high grounds that you can hold from, corners, and there's enough distance, but also not too much so that there's opportunities for you to make plays. We struggle to think of a really good map for Brig, but I think Rialto is good enough. And while we're on that map, Circuit and Havana, long sightlines. I would rather play Brigitte in a shorter, brawlier comp than something that I can literally never get onto. Now, the thing with Brigitte is many of the times it's more about what the enemy picks than it is what the map is. So we talk about finding the balance between enemy composition and map. Brigitte is definitely one of those characters where you're going to be paying a little bit more attention to the comp than you are to the map. So if you're on Circuit Royale and they're playing Sombra, Tracer, Wrecking Ball, and you're like, well, I'm not going to play Brigitte because Coach Spilo didn't, you're an idiot. Play Brigitte, please. Brigitte is great into that. If you're on Havana or you're on Rialto and they're playing Pharmacy Junkrat, you might need to swap. You're either going to go flank Brig or you're going to need to swap. There's not a lot that you can do. So do pay attention to composition. Brigitte is one of those characters where she is dynamic with her playstyle, but she's not as dynamic as we like her. And so sometimes she struggles versus the compositions more than the map. Illari. A character that kind of takes a solo angle and pokes, and that's pretty much all she does. If you're looking to shoot shields, there are a lot of characters that do better than that. Looking to kill tanks, a lot of characters can do better than that. Peel the backline, there's a lot of characters that can do that better. And dive the enemy backline, there's more characters that can do that. So she's kind of the weird hybrid where she sits inside her little niche, she holds an off angle and she pokes, and that's all she does. In a map like Rialto, similar to Brigitte, she's going to have a lot of fun with that. There's enough verticality with her shift to be able to control high grounds, a lot of nice sightlines without being too long, and there's a lot of flanks that are available. We move on to maps like Flashpoint. We're going to be moving around a lot, maybe dealing a lot with flankers. Gibraltar, a lot of verticality along a super long sightlines. Circuit Royale as well. Again, that map keeps coming up. There are way better supports than Illari, and I actually find her to be one of the most limited supports in terms of playstyle. She generally does one thing, she does it well, and if the map or composition doesn't let her do it, then she's not going to feel all that good. Keep that in mind. Kiriko. She's good in Esperanza. Really good. There's a lot of flanks and angles you can take in that map, but man, she's good on everything. Very dynamic character. A lot of positioning. I know the Kiriko anti-mains are shrieking right now, but she's really good everywhere. The wall climb especially gives her a lot of flexibility with how she can position. I would say that she may not be the best short-range healer. So if you're playing a Lijiang Tower Brawl Mirror, maybe there are better healers than that. Ana, Baptiste, Lucio, Moira, and so on. But she does even okay in those because although her healing per second isn't all that great, her ultimate is really good in the Brawl Mirrors. And so maybe she's playable. Bad map, Circuit. She can dink Widowmakers, but if she can't really take a flank on the Widowmaker, which it is harder on that map, it's not great. And there are better supports that do things better than Kiriko in those tank matchups. Even back in my original Kiriko guide, way back when she was initially released, I called out Circuit Royale as not being the best matchup for her. And even with the opportunity to duel snipers, it's still not necessarily the best. Now, I will say that your ultimate's pretty good on that map, so take that as you will. Lifeweaver, character that likes high ground and kind of wants to play, I always say the intergalactic emperor mindset, where you can see a lot of things and pull and control and pull the things, but without really being under a lot of threat yourself, or at least being under not too much threat, because Lifeweaver does have survivability that you can utilize. Numbani is like one of those good maps where you can pretty much see everything at all times, so on attack or defense for the most part. And then your pedal is going to provide that verticality at first and second point. And then if you fight on point, you fight here and there, your tree is going to be able to provide value of that as well. I think that's a pretty good map for Lifeweaver. And then bad maps are maps where you're either going to have these extreme angles and sightlines like Havana, not going to be super great. Kind of broad. It might be hard to see everything. It might be hard to see everything without peeking a sniper. Ironically, Circuit Royale is probably the better map because of the short sightlines. It's easier to avoid the Widowmaker. And if all you're going to be doing is healing anyway, you don't even need to peek the Widowmaker. Not to mention your tree is going to get a lot of value on Circuit Royale, especially the first couple of points. Li Jiang. Not a great map for him either because it's again one of those situations where it's pretty easy to run you down as opposed to some of the other maps. And the vertical mobility doesn't really help you all that much. Is it a bad map for Lifeweaver? I wouldn't say it's bad. It's just not the best map. And there's probably better supports fitted for that role. Lucio. Li Jiang Tower. Need I say anything more? Ilios as well, I guess. Any map where you can provide a lot of boops, any map where you can speed people around, and any maps, crucially, where you can quickly close the distance on DPS and supports when you want to Reddit, and you should be Redditing at points in time. Those maps all provide those opportunities. Bad maps? Well, sniper maps. It's hard to get onto the enemy backline when they're like way over there. Some of you guys are like, well, I could do it. Oh boy. Havana, definitely a tricky map to close the distance on. And coincidentally, Gibraltar as well is again one of those maps with that vertical mobility. Can Lucio wall right up to high ground? Yeah, but it just adds an extra step of difficulty. And when I'm playing Lucio on Gibraltar attack, I feel pretty useless because I'm thinking I can't get over there without spending about 6 years getting there. And I don't even know if I'm going to be able to get that kill. Tough map. Havana and Gibraltar generally avoid Lucio on those maps. Mercy, Paraíso. Longer sightlines, so that damage boosted DPS can really put out some punishment. And man, the verticality in that map provides so many super jump opportunities. It could be downright near impossible to kill a Mercy on second point Paraíso. And even first and third point attack and defense provide a lot of escape opportunities. Valk is pretty good there. Vertical mobility. The DPS pocket is really good on those maps as well. Heroes like Hanzo, Sojourn, Pharah, Genji, Echo, all those characters function really well on that map. So I think Mercy's great in Paraíso. And on that note, maps that don't provide that same level of vertical mobility and require a lot of movement with a character that's quick but vulnerable. New Junk City, Antarctic, Li Jiang. Not great characters for Mercy, although the asterisk is that Li Jiang is amazing if you have a Pharah. But if a character is reliant on another character pick to be viable on a specific map, then maybe that character isn't all that great for the map. So if you have a Pharah on Li Jiang, pick Mercy. It's great. If you don't have a Pharah, be careful. Moira. She likes short sightlines. She likes flanks. Antarctica is great. DPS Moira, heal Moira, whatever kind of variation or somewhere in between that you want to provide, Antarctica is going to be a really good map for Moira. Lots of short sightlines, lots of angles, lots of flanks, lots of ways to bounce orbs, lots of things to do on that map. But then we get maps like Havana and Junkerqueen, and if you're not hard flanking on the enemy backline, I don't know what you do with that map. Now, before you say, well, I'm going to heal the tank. Yeah, they're better characters that do a better job of doing that, and you don't even have the ability to punish the enemy tank that Baptiste and Ana have, and so, yeah. Zenyatta, long sightline sniper character. I know he has 225 HP now, but the character is still amazing at burning tanks and burning DPS as long as he has a little bit of distance. Havana, honorable mention, actually goes to Circuit because he, I think, actually may contest Baptiste for the best support on that map. And even a map like Blizzard World that is relatively flank available because those flanks are so long and the sightlines are so good. If you're good in Zenyatta, you can do a lot of work on Blizzard World. Now, bad maps. Zenyatta, not the greatest on Li Jiang Tower for the very opposite of the reasons that we talked about why he's good. Those shorter sightlines can be a little bit tricky. It can be very easy to get on top of you, hard to find good spam angles, hard to find consistent pressure. And also Flashpoint. Again, the movement required in Flashpoint for the spawns, moving to there and moving to there. Any character without a defensive cooldown, and especially without mobility, feels kind of tough. And it's really easy to get spawn camped. And even if you're not getting spawn camped, it could be very much like, hey guys, where... You're kind of screwed with Zenyatta sometimes. So while the character definitely is a little tankier than he used to be, has a little bit more dynamics in Overwatch 2 than he did before, still struggles with some of the same issues moving forward. Well, that's going to wrap this up. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments. As I said, this is aimed for the average player base. This isn't exactly the perfect answer for when to play each character. These are general guidelines, so please use them appropriately. Remember that the map is only half of the equation. The other half is your comp, the enemy comp, and really the 100% of the equation is just what do you want to play? What do you want to practice? Playing Counterwatch is really only going to get you so far. At some point, you have to learn how to counterpick and counterplay with just the character that you're playing. What kind of different things can I be doing with this character that the enemy team might not be able to exploit? Let me know if you have any questions, as I said, in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.